Horror is a genre I never enjoyed. I didn't like the feeling of being scared, and horror games is something I mostly ignored. The few horror games I played were pretty tame compared to other horror games. I was never really excited for new releases, and I never really batted an eye at older horror games. As someone who was creeped out by the Valve logo, you can understand why I would skip out on horror games. However, I knew by not playing these games, I really missed out on some gems. I wanted to understand horror games, to try to understand why people like them so much. I wanted to start this off by playing older horror games that I missed. I know Capcom was the king of horror back in the day with games like Resident Evil, Dino Crisis, and even Clock Tower, but I wanted to play one of the most overlooked and underappreciated titles Capcom had, Haunting Ground. So I hopped on eBay and picked up a copy. I started with Haunting Ground because it was a game I knew very little about, but I had heard of. Haunting Ground was written by Makoto Ikihara and Noboru Sugimura, Sugimura being the writer of Resident Evil 2, Code Veronica, and other horror titles. Haunting Ground would be the last game Sugimura wrote for before unfortunately passing away. Haunting Ground is unlike any horror game I had ever played. You play as Fiona Belli, a young woman who has been brought to a castle after getting into a car accident with her parents. Something I want to say about Haunting Ground is it's a very sexual horror game. Things like forced pregnancy are heavily implied in this game, and if that makes you uncomfortable, you should probably skip Haunting Ground altogether. Fiona is not a strong character, and I only mean that in terms of strength. What she goes through in this game is worse than any horror game character I've ever played as. During a time when horror protagonists pick up a brick or a pipe ready to defend themselves against a demon from hell, I feel Fiona channels what most people would feel: fear. Sure, fight or flight responses exist, but when you're up against something that looks like this, and you look like this, the choice is clear: you run. I feel this is why Fiona is a good character. You aren't some badass that's roundhouse kicking enemies chasing you. You're a young woman being chased by a bunch of sex pests who want to do terrible things to her. In most horror games, if the protagonist dies, it's over for them. You can feel bad for them, but their horror is over. If Fiona gets caught, it's only going to get worse for her. Fiona isn't a fighter. She has to run and hide from the people chasing her. The only defense she gets is a dog named Huey that she frees early on in the game. You control Huey with the right thumbstick, telling him to attack an enemy, to search for something, or do what I just did and call him over every time you enter a new room. There are times when Huey will ignore your commands, and the devs thought of this thankfully and give you an option to scold Huey if he ignores you. But when you're being chased by someone, all you really want is for Huey to attack them and slow them down, and instead he starts sniffing the fucking floor. Huey isn't a bad companion. He works well, I'd say about 80% of the time. You can use Huey to attack the person chasing you, and if you attack them long enough, they'll fall to the floor and stay there for a while. This gives you plenty of time to hide. What I found to be a really clever idea is when somebody's coming after Fiona, Huey will begin to growl at them from a good distance away or a room away. This won't alert the enemy looking for you, but it's a really clever way of letting you know when somebody's near. Huey can also get lost if you run away from him while he's attacking an enemy. He usually lets out a bark or a cry if he's not in the same room as you to help you find him. If that sounds annoying, trust me it isn't, because during this, Huey will also look for Fiona too. I only had a hard time finding Huey once after I abandoned the poor dog to get away from someone. Haunting Ground has fixed camera angles similar to the Resident Evil games, and normally I hate this stuff, but it wasn't so bad in Haunting Ground. I did have moments where I spun around while someone was chasing me when I was in a new room, but it rarely happened. What I really like about Haunting Ground is hiding and running away from enemies. There are a ton of hiding spots Fiona can go in, however if you're hiding in one spot too long or using that spot repeatedly, eventually you'll be found out and have to run away and find a new hiding spot. And what I really like is you don't even need to find special hiding spots. You can hide behind anything in the environment as long as you break sight with the enemy. When Fiona is spotted by an enemy or when she's panicking, she'll swing doors open and close them much quicker, with a more energetic animation than she would if she was calm. I love this. This adds a sense of urgency. The problem is during these animations you can't cancel it, so if you're trying to close a door behind you while you're being pursued, make sure you're actually in the next room before closing the door, or you'll be standing next to the enemy closing the door to your only escape. In the entirety of Haunting Ground, you'll be playing inside of a castle. While each room is pretty different, it can be easy to get lost in, especially when you're being chased. At one point in the game, I was so lost that I kept hiding under the same sofa over and over because it was the only spot I could remember where a hiding spot was. If ever you do get stuck though, Fiona will have some comments on her current situation that you can check by pausing the game. This is another thing Haunting Ground does really well. While you can pause the game to check your items or the map, that's the only time the game will stand still. During puzzles or reading dialogue, an enemy can still be on the lookout for you. It's the atmosphere that this game does best. It's the music that plays when you're spotted, or the music of just looking around finding out what to do next. Each enemy has their own song that plays when you're spotted. It's the footsteps you hear getting louder right before Huey begins to growl. The game doesn't rely on jump scares because it doesn't need to. The game lets atmosphere take care of the suspense and surprises that come next. The game does a good job of putting pressure on you. Rarely do you have really large moments of time where you can be calm and catch your breath and think of what to do next. While the game allows you time to figure out what to do, you still have no idea when an enemy will be out looking for you. There are no safe areas in Haunting Ground. In a lot of horror games like Resident Evil, you have a safe room where you can unwind and relax for a bit in total security. Like in Dark Souls or Bloodborne, you have bonfires where you're totally safe from any danger. You don't get this in Haunting Ground because every room can be opened by an enemy, and the only thing stopping the flow of time in game is by pausing it or checking the map. Reading dialogue and solving puzzles can be interrupted by an enemy, and you can't just solve a puzzle and run off to another room to reset the chase. And this might sound tedious, but it adds suspense to the game. This also works with saving the game. To save the game, you need to interact with any clock, but to even do that, you can't be running away from anyone, or you need to be far enough away. Tying back to the atmosphere of the game, the clocks make a sound so you know when you're near one. This adds a bit of calm and reassurance. Haunting Ground doesn't have checkpoints, and I don't know if many horror games do, but I like that you get sent to your last save more. This makes you play more cautiously when that crazy maid bitch is chasing you. Just knowing that I saved makes me feel more calm and allows me to play a little more reckless, and I saved quite a lot. Another thing I love is that I never ran into a loading screen while moving into different rooms. This works so well because an enemy chasing you will always be behind you. You can't just run into another door, wait for a load screen, and suddenly the pursuer is spawned somewhere else, or inactive. The game doesn't break immersion with loading screens. You're going to be chased until you get caught or you lose the person chasing you. When starting out, however, the enemy chasing you will only look for you every few minutes, like 10 or 15 minutes, and as you continue through the story, they'll become more and more aggressive, and will start hunting Fiona more often. And I really like that the game does this, because just when you're getting comfortable, the game becomes even more stressful. Like a lot of horror games, Haunting Ground doesn't have a UI, but unlike most horror games, you also don't get a health or stamina status either. Fiona will indicate when she's getting tired or when she's hurt because she'll start running slower and then she'll start raising her hand up to her chest. Eventually she'll come to a stop and catch her breath. This again doesn't break immersion by having to stop and pause to check your health and stamina. Of course there are items that help regain health, stamina, and lower Fiona's panic, but another thing Haunting Ground does really well is show us that Fiona has no fucking idea what these items do. This is great because it shows you that Fiona is just a girl who happens to fall into this terrible situation. Obviously, in the story, there's a reason for her to be here, but for the player and Fiona, they have no idea why she's here at first. Some of these items can actually cause Fiona and Huey harm by making them more tired or panicked. Huey can even become more aggressive and do more damage to enemies, but will also bite Fiona if she gets too close. The only way to know what some of these items do is by using them, so pick your favorite colored candy and see what happens. If Fiona is panicked, she'll scream and get a second wind of energy. She'll run really fast for a short while, but be warned she'll run into everything. And if she runs into too many things, she'll trip and crawl around for a while. If you're caught while crawling, it's pretty much game over, unless Huey comes and saves you. Haunting Ground honestly surprised me. I really didn't think I would enjoy it as much as I did. I enjoyed the characters of the game. Fiona was a fun character to play as. I think she was well written. She acts like any of us would, with shock and fear. She doesn't care what's in the castle or who's behind it. She just wants to leave. She couldn't fight, so she acted the only way she could by running and hiding. Sure, the game had some puzzles that annoyed me, and for being a character who can't really fight, she sure had one hell of a kick. This did confuse me because there was a spot in the game where she kicks down some debris blocking her way, and I was stuck here for like 30 minutes trying to figure out what to do because I didn't think she would be strong enough to kick it down. This is probably my fault though, because I'm sure had I investigated it, Fiona would have commented that she could probably break it. It was a fun game though, and I think this was a good first step to restart my journey through horror games. The next horror game I played was Silent Hill 3, developed and published by the company that hates money, but they made Metal Gear Solid and DDR, so everything's okay. I had only played one other Silent Hill game up to this point, and that was Silent Hill Homecoming, and everyone says it's bad. I probably should have started with the first and second Silent Hill games first, but it's fine because I knew enough of the series to get by. Silent Hill 3 also fills in a bit of backstory for you, so that helps out a lot. Silent Hill 3, just like Haunting Ground, was released on the PS2 and PC. It really feels like the 6th generation of consoles was a goldmine for horror games. Just like Haunting Ground, Silent Hill 3 also cost a good bit of money, so, you know. Silent Hill 3 is a sequel to the first Silent Hill game. In Silent Hill 3, you play as Heather Mason, the daughter of Harry Mason, the protagonist of the first Silent Hill game. Now, you might say to yourself, she kinda looks like Fiona. And sure, I guess, but there's one big difference between Fiona and Heather. This bitch can fight. Silent Hill 3 starts you off in Heather's nightmare inside of an abandoned amusement park. The game hands you everything at the start. All the weapons and items you could want are given to you, and at first I thought it was a bug or maybe I had a save preloaded on the game. But I want to explain why I actually think this is a good idea. The game starts you off in an abandoned area where there's nothing to do but explore. This is good because it teaches you how Heather controls in the game. Silent Hill 3 uses something called tank controls, and they're really not that bad. Just push forward and the character will always go forward in the direction they're facing. This works really well with games that have fixed camera angles like the early Resident Evil games. Silent Hill 3 also has some fixed camera angles, but for the most part you're able to center the camera behind Heather with the shoulder button. So after you get used to the controls, you move on to the next area, and this is where you'll face your first enemy. This is where you'll get used to combat and running away from enemies before Heather gets hit by a roller coaster and the game ends. The next game I wanted to play was after this Heather wakes up and you start your comical adventure. Something I want to add is that Silent Hill has multiple difficulty modes, and some genius at Konami knew that someone like me would play the game one day and added a difficulty mode for the puzzles in game. I chose a normal difficulty to challenge myself, of course, and I still struggled. Silent Hill 3 starts you off in an abandoned amusement park but moves you to a bunch of different locations. There's something special about Heather, and she's being tracked down by a cult, and if that isn't creepy enough, the world around her is changing all the time. This other world is obviously darker and spookier, and you can't see a damn thing in this place, but hey, that adds to the fear, so good job. And if you play Silent Hill 3, get ready to hear this sound a lot. Because every damn door in this game is locked. This carries over pretty much every location you visit in the game. The game is dark too, like visually dark. There are some areas where it's practically pitch black, and then you go to the other world, which is even darker. But thankfully you're given a flashlight and a gun very early in the game, and for the love of God, do not miss this pipe. Because guns are pretty much useless in this game. Ammo isn't too hard to find, and in fact I beat the game with over 100 bullets left for the pistol. And because the game is set in America, a shotgun can be found in the subway ready to be handed to someone as a gift. Now you might be scared to fight monsters in this game with just melee weapons, but don't be. Most of the time you can run right past them, and some monsters like the dogs are really fast, so you might want to deal with them first. Combat in Silent Hill 3 really isn't that great. For the smaller enemies, you can just stun lock them, just smack the shit out of them a few times and they'll just stand there and take it. Sometimes, if you're outnumbered, the second monster will just watch you beat its friend to death like it's a Bruce Lee movie. The dogs can be difficult, however, because a lot of times they'll just jump into Heather and bite her at the same time and then immediately run afterwards. Also, Heather will swing just above them so you won't be able to land a hit on them. Because Silent Hill 3 gives you two attacks for melee weapons. You have a heavy attack and a light attack. Use the heavy attack to hit monsters that are just under your swing, and you can also block attacks with melee weapons. I feel in most horror games your first decision should be to run and not fight. But if you do get in a fight, don't worry too much because Heather can take one hell of a punch. The bigger monsters in game are usually pretty slow, and their attacks are really slow, and they have a really large telegraph giving you enough time to move out of the way. You can also just outrun most of them. Something that did disappoint me a little bit was in the first part of the game when you're in the abandoned amusement park, you face 3 different enemies. There are about 8 common monsters in the game that aren't bosses. It's not the number of monsters that bothers me, it's that showing you almost half of them so early is a bit of a letdown for me. Other times you can't gain their attention and they walk right by you, but that's pretty much it. They're all scary, and just hearing noises from each one of them entering a new room scared me. There's a few different kind of monsters, and not to spoil anything, but one of them breaks the rhythm that you're used to, because it's fast, and it runs at you. Unfortunately, you can just kick its ass because it also gets stun locked. It's when you're outnumbered when it's best to run. Monsters do respawn, or different monsters are placed in different areas the further you go into the story. You might solve a puzzle after killing some of them and come out of that room to find new monsters placed there. On the topic of monsters, boss battles are also a thing in Silent Hill, and oh boy are they fun. Every fight is different, but they're all dealt with the same way, with violence. This is where guns come in handy, because obviously bosses do much more damage than normal enemies would, so I kept my distance and shot them. I think it's more important to have health items than it is to have extra bullets, because like I said, Heather can take a punch, and especially if you have body armor. This slows her down a bit, and honestly I don't even remember where I found it, but it sure did take a lot of hits to kill Heather. All of the bosses in the game are really scary and unique, especially the final boss in the game. There aren't many bosses in the game, there's about 5 of them, but most of them have a meaning in the story. If you happen to die in Silent Hill 3, the game surprisingly has a checkpoint system. I'm not sure how it works, but when I died fighting a boss, I would get sent back to that boss battle instead of the last save I had. But on another part of the game I died and I was sent back to my previous save. So I'm not sure how it works exactly, but I feel it's a pretty good balance of not holding your hand and creating a checkpoint every time you go into a new room. Checkpoints didn't really matter to me, however, because thankfully the devs placed plenty of save points around the game. And oh boy, did I use them. Silent Hill 3 gives you safe rooms or areas where you can save in, but I never really felt at ease in these rooms. The game does a really good job at placing stress on you while you're in these areas, just with the sounds of the game and the music. When you're in a safe room, it's totally quiet, and at first I thought it was kind of weird because I was expecting some calming music to put a sense of security, but Silent Hill doesn't do that. It's just quiet, and in a way it's comforting. To be alone with your thoughts and just escape the monsters outside the room, but it isn't soothing. I felt that maybe something might happen in this room. I knew that there weren't any monsters near me and I wasn't in any danger in the safe room, but maybe the game would break this pattern, just for a scare. The silence in the safe room is creepy. And while we're talking about audio in the game, this leads me to my next point and the greatest thing that Silent Hill does, the radio. Basically, when you're nearing an enemy, the radio will begin to make a static sound. The closer you are to an enemy, the louder it gets. It's fantastic, and I cannot stress this enough on how good of an idea this is. The sound design of this game is top-notch. The cacophony of sounds building up as enemies get near you, the sound of Heather's footsteps clanking on the metal floor, but most importantly, you can turn the radio off or raise and lower the volume. There are no visual animations for Heather if she's low on health, so you'll just have to pause the game and check, and I don't think there's a stamina mechanic at all. I say this because after you stop swinging your melee weapon around a bunch of times, she'll start breathing heavily and trying to catch her breath, but I can just keep swinging away while this is happening. Maybe there's a stamina mechanic and I just never ran out. I was playing this on normal difficulty, by the way, and it was pretty easy, probably because I ran away from most of the enemies, and that's probably how you would play the game anyways. On normal difficulty, the game can be very generous with health items, and at times, items can also be easy to miss. Every item in the game is rendered in the level, so nothing is highlighted, unlike in Haunting Ground when an item is marked with a sparkle or something to catch your eye. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, it's just something to keep in mind. The game does give you hints on where an item is, usually with a camera angle, and Heather will turn her head towards an item of interest. The thing about Heather is she's really only afraid of the first monster she sees. After that, she isn't afraid of anything, and while that's pretty badass, it kind of takes me out of the mood a bit. It makes me relate to Fiona more because while this would scare me, this would cause heart palpitations in me. And Heather treats it like it's another Tuesday. I do kind of understand though. Something happens early in the game that makes Heather determined to find out why this stuff is happening to her. And maybe that determination outweighs the fear of these monsters. And while that may not be the healthiest approach to it, that's how Heather takes care of it. I'm not saying Heather is an emotionless character because she does show emotion. She gets angry, she feels sorrow, she gets creeped out by some of the things later in game. It's these monsters that don't seem to bother her much. I like Heather, I think she's a fun character. It's really interesting to watch her go through all this to see how determined she is to make sure she gets to the end of this, and to watch how she processes what happens after everything is done. I know there's much more to her than what Silent Hill 3 shows us, and I'm looking forward to playing Silent Hill 1 to have some of these questions answered. Overall, Silent Hill 3 easily became my favorite Silent Hill game. It really wasn't much of a competition, to be honest. And Heather became my favorite Silent Hill protagonist. Again, not much of a competition. I will say I was more scared of what was happening in the game than Heather was. Also, visually, this game looks really good still. The game came out in 2003. Haunting Ground looked really good too, and it surprises me how well these games still look today. Also, the first puzzle in the game, you should put these books back on the shelf to figure out the combination code for the door. I try to be a rocket scientist and figure it out while examining them in my inventory, and while I got the code figured out, I had Heather lug these 5 volumes of Shakespeare all the way to the final boss. Lost in Vivo was my next horror game stop. For $11, it's a steal. Developed by Kira, you may know them from their other work they've done like Spooky's Jumpscare Mansion. Lost in Vivo has a PS1 aesthetic to it, and it's a first-person survival horror game. In Lost in Vivo, you play as an unknown protagonist whose dog was swept away by heavy rain into a sewer drain. And so our protagonist goes down into the manhole to find their dog. And the first thing I try to do was find a way to get back up to the surface. In the beginning of the game, it's recommended that you play with headphones to get the full effect of the game's audio, and I can say you should absolutely use headphones when playing this game. The 3D audio in Lost in Vivo is how you'll hear where an enemy is and how far away they are. One of the first enemies in the game shows you how important this really is, because that enemy can phase through a wall. An audio cue will happen when they're coming, where they're coming from, and how close they are. One thing you'll notice that in Lost in Vivo the level design is very tight. It's very claustrophobic going through the sewers, the hallways, down a subway, or a hole in the wall, because why not? As you progress through the game, you'll be doing puzzles and learning more about the area you're currently in before moving on to a different area. With each new area, you're given a bit of backstory. The environments in Lost in Vivo are just as scary as the other games I've played, but one thing I will say about Lost in Vivo is that the lighting in the game really impressed me with how well it stood out. The game isn't too dark and it has just enough light to keep an eerie feeling. Thankfully, in those dark sections, you have a flashlight, and Lost in Vivo gives you a flashlight that actually works. Lost in Vivo's levels are actually really fun to navigate through. I never felt lost playing the game. You can find a map like you can in most horror games, but it's really easy to memorize where I was and where I've been. Each one of these enemies are really different from each other, except for the leech and the other leech that's slightly bigger. As corny as this is gonna sound, this game actually scared me a lot. Silent Hill and Haunting Ground also scared me, but Lost in Vivo was on another level for me. Again, as corny as it sounds, this game made my skin crawl. Very early in the game, you have a point where you have to use a lockpick to unlock a door, and it's RNG. It's not a bad RNG, I only failed unlocking the door once during this time, but having to unlock a door while hearing something coming closer and closer to you panicked the absolute hell out of me. There are no warning sounds like the radio in Silent Hill in this game, just sounds of enemies coming closer to you or hiding around the corner. To deal with these threats, however, you have a few weapons to choose from. A sledgehammer, a handgun, a shotgun, and a knife. The first time I picked up the pistol, I thought it was a single-fire pistol like the tranquilizer gun in Metal Gear Solid. It's a semi-automatic pistol, but I thought that after every shot you would take, you would have to pull the slide back to load another round. I thought that would add a bit of extra urgency on how well you had to place your shot, but you can just go ham with it. The game spaced its ammo out pretty well. I always had some ammo on hand, but when I was running low, I would definitely worry a bit. But the sledgehammer is the way to go for melee weapons. It didn't feel like it had much weight to it, and what I mean by that is, when I would hit an enemy with it, the enemy would just slide back. This is absolutely a nitpick because it doesn't affect gameplay at all. Another problem I had with the game was in this one section of the game I had Unity text appear, and in another section of the game I fell through the floor. Again, nothing bad, just a quick reload and I was back to playing the game no problem, though the Unity text would still appear. There are bosses in this game, but you really can't fight them. You just kinda have to work around them or outsmart them, and I actually really enjoy this. While I think the normal enemies are scarier, it's still spooky hearing a boss chase you down as you try to figure out what to do. And the thing you have to do to defeat one certain boss is really clever on how the game explains it to you. Speaking of reloading, Lost in Vivo has some of the calmest safe room music I've ever heard. In fact, the entire soundtrack of all the horror games I've played were fantastic, and they're all on Spotify. You can also buy Lost in Vivo's soundtrack on Steam. Every safe room is marked with a blue door. Here you can save your game, and I cannot stress enough how much I love manual saving, until your game crashes, which didn't happen while playing Lost in Vivo. Health regenerates on its own in this game, so that's different from all the other horror games I played, but there are no health bars, and the only way to check your health is to check your inventory by pausing the game. Health only regenerates when you're actually playing, so you can't just pause the game and regain all your health like I tried to do. Every horror game I've mentioned so far has different endings, and this game is no different. I save scum as much as possible playing these games, but I never look up what to do to get a more preferred ending. I feel like that spoils the surprise. Once you beat Lost in Vivo, you still have more to do. Within the levels, you can find cassette tapes that offer extra gameplay and a little story of their own. They're not long, usually lasting 15 to 20 minutes, but it's something fun that the game adds just for extra content. You can also play New Game Plus in Lost in Vivo, and surprisingly, it adds some new enemies to the game. Overall, Lost in Vivo was definitely the scariest game I've played recently. It wasn't very long. I started it and finished it in about 3.5 hours, but it was only $11 and I really can't complain. The number of enemies and the enemy designs were all fun. The level design and the lighting in the game, the scripted scary events. This game surprised me because I really didn't think it would be as scary as it was. And all of this for $11. And that's the normal price. I'm sure it drops down to like $7 on a sale. Lost in Vivo was a fantastic game and I enjoyed every minute of it. Faith was the last game I played on my horror adventure. I went from PS1 style graphics of Lost in Vivo to second generation console Atari 2600 graphics of Faith. Faith is a game developed by Airdorf Games. Faith has 3 chapters of the game, with each chapter being its own game. Faith takes place in the year 1987. You play as John Ward, a priest who has returned to a house of a failed exorcism he had performed a year ago. This is all part of a larger story, and this is just the story of the first game. I'll talk a little bit about each chapter without spoiling anything so you can go enjoy the game yourself. Chapter 1 of Faith has John come back to an old house where he and another priest failed to do an exorcism together. Because of nightmares he's having and guilt for not saving that person, he's come back to the house to try to save them this time. When you start playing Faith, you'll realize the game has some voice dialogue. Fitting for its time, it uses speech synthesis. SAM, or Software Automatic Mouth, is a software used to create the voices in-game.
September 21st, 1987.
It's creepy hearing John or anyone else talk, and it works really well. All of the spoken dialogue is done this way, but for every character speaking, it will have a different sound to it. The gameplay of Faith is as simple as the graphics are. You move and hold up your cross to ward off or kill enemies. You have no health bar or anything really, just one hit and it's game over. The first chapter takes place in the forest. You make your way to the house where the failed exorcism took place. As you make your way to the house, you can find hidden notes in certain environments by holding up your cross to it. It's pretty easy to tell what you can interact with and get a note out of it. Other times they'll be just laying on the ground. These notes give a bit of backstory of the events leading up to what happened about the Martin family, and about Amy Martin, the girl who was possessed. There are different areas you can wander around in the first chapter, though it all takes place in a big forest. You'll eventually enter the Martin family home, and this is an area on its own, with different rooms, an upstairs, and a basement. Making your way to the house is a bit of a journey, and you'll most likely encounter your first enemy here. It's surprising how scary this 8-bit game can be, because while the demon can surprise you popping out of the corner of your screen, it's the sound the demon makes when it's coming towards you. It's actually pretty fast too. You have to react pretty quickly to it, and like I said, one hit will kill you. You only have 4 directions to look in, but the range of the cross is really wide. It doesn't stretch across the screen or anything, but I thought it worked more as a cone, like a vision cone in MGS. If an enemy walks within that cone, they'll take damage. There are no manual saves in this game, and as much as I love manual saving, I can give a pass for Faith, just because it's easy to die in this game, and you will die a lot. Faith has an autosave feature that activates when something changes in the story or depending on your progress. This is one of the reasons I don't like autosaves, because it kind of spoils a surprise that could be happening soon, like a boss fight or a scare. It also reduces the stress of having to look for a save room. But Faith doesn't really save that often. If you die in the forest before making it to the house, you usually get set back to the beginning of the game. Faith doesn't rely on jump scares for pretty much all of the game. It works by building up tension through the environment and music. The music works extremely well with building up tension, keeping the audio sounding like an old computer. The soundtrack was made by Airdorf himself, and everything just blends so well together. The music changes when entering a different area. Sometimes there isn't any music and it's just pure silence. One song in particular had me reading a note as fast as possible because it sounded like something else was coming towards me. And that's a good thing. It's something to keep the pressure on even when nothing's happening. If a room is empty, usually you're safe. Enemies don't respawn, and honestly it's kinda rare to see them, and that makes them even more scary when you do face them. The set pieces of Faith is another thing that the game does really well. It could be something as simple as watching someone run across the window outside, or a deer coming off the screen running towards you. In the first chapter of Faith, you'll really only fight one enemy roaming around, and it's the one you'll see in the forest. Faith does have boss battles though, and the very first one you'll probably fight is at the end of chapter 1. It's actually pretty hard. It's nothing unfair, and you'll probably die a few times fighting the boss. There are different stages in the boss fight, and it can actually last quite a while if you're bad at it like I was. The difficulty for bosses in later chapters felt easier to me, but all of them are different. And although you fight them the same way by holding up your cross and dealing damage to them, bosses don't repeat, and there are even some secret bosses you can discover. Now, something that's really cool is Faith's cutscenes, and I'm not talking about these cutscenes. I'm talking about these cutscenes. Faith uses a technique called rotoscoping for their animated cutscenes. It's something that I personally have never seen in a game before, and I think it looks fantastic. Keeping with the colors of the game, each character is usually one color, with most cutscenes consisting of 3 colors at most. None of the rotoscoping cutscenes are skippable, and that's fine because they're usually really short. The only time it can be a little annoying is when there's a cutscene right before a boss fight. If you lose to that boss, you'll have to rewatch the cutscene every time, and being a one-hit kill, you'll be watching that cutscene quite a few times. And this is a total nitpick, don't get me wrong. From what I can remember, this is really only a thing on the first chapter. You can actually watch some of these cutscenes being played out by Airdorf himself on YouTube, and I'll leave a link to his video and channel in the description. Faith is so well made that I really don't have anything else bad to say about it. Faith is incredibly simplistic to look at, yet so complicated. The music, the story, the rotoscoped cutscenes, the puzzles, even the creativity of using speech synthesis blew me away. And this is just chapter 1. Every chapter of Faith is longer than the one preceding it, with the first chapter being about an hour long for me, chapter 2 being about an hour and a half, and finally chapter 3 being about 2.5 hours long. Chapter 2 of Faith has you meet and play as another character of the story, Father Garcia. Father Garcia is the second priest you play as in-game, only for a short bit though, then you're back to playing as John. But Father Garcia is a badass, and you'll see why when you play the game later. He also has a really nice run animation. But again, I love how all the characters have the same speech synthesis, just at different pitches. Chapter 2 continues the story of Chapter 1 while filling in some of the backstory, like who this demon is. But now John is exploring a cemetery while finding clues on a cult that may or may not have something to do with Amy Martin, and maybe the reason why she was possessed. All of Faith has notes that give you some more story on the game, and through these notes you'll learn more about the cult and its leader, Gary. Chapter 2 carries on what Chapter 1 has, but adds more enemies and more locations. In the first chapter you have a forest to explore and eventually the Martin home. Chapter 2 takes you to a small apartment, a cemetery, a church, and finally into some tunnels. Chapter 2 also has more creative puzzles and introduces something really cool. A flashlight. I honestly thought the flashlight was really cool though. Having to fight while only seeing a small cone of vision, and every time you turn around something else can just run across the screen, it gives you a good sense of panic. Chapter 3 of Faith is the largest chapter in the game. Chapter 3 starts you off with the events leading up to the exorcism of Amy Martin, a year before the start of the first chapter. And just like Chapter 2, Chapter 3 improves on almost everything of the previous chapter. Chapter 3 has multiple locations you'll be in, with even more creative puzzles in the first 2 chapters and even more creative bosses. Chapter 3 continues the story of the investigation of the cult you learned about in Chapter 2, and unfortunately that's all I can say without spoiling anything. I want to end talking about Faith with this. I enjoyed playing Faith. I do apologize that I did not talk about Chapter 2 and 3 enough, and it's because Faith is a really cool game with an intricate story. It's simple to look at and even simpler to play, yet every other part of this game has been crafted so well. Faith is a really unique game. Something this simple should not be as scary as it is, yet it was. Faith doesn't rely on jump scares. It builds its stress and fear not through graphics but through everything else. Audio, storytelling, and even through the environment. Having voice characters done through speech synthesis adds an uncanny feeling through the entire game. What Airdorf has done with this game is nothing short of amazing. I highly recommend you play this game because it is as simple as it comes in terms of control that anyone can pick up, yet it offers so much and it's only $14 on Steam. When I started this, I really didn't expect anything to change. I dislike horror games because why the hell would you willingly want to be afraid? To give some background on this, I'm not a movie guy at all, so horror movies were a thing I never really watched. But playing through these games has been quite the experience, and as corny as that is, these games are really fun, and being afraid but knowing everything's gonna be okay is pretty comforting. Maybe that's the appeal to these games. But for me, it was the story each one of these games had. All of the characters you play as and getting them through the horror they're going through, you also conquer your own fears, because games like Lost in Vivo were hell to play through. But the satisfaction of getting through it was something I wasn't expecting, and all of these games have multiple endings. Faith alone has something like 12 different endings, and as soon as I finished one, I wanted to play again to try to find another ending. I loved every game that I played in this video. I hated how scary Lost in Vivo was. It made my skin crawl, and it's something that's never happened to me before while playing a video game. It was such a fun game to play through though. Silent Hill 3 was also a fun game to play through, with a story that surprised me while watching Heather handle everything that came her way. Playing through Faith was surprising too. I knew little to nothing about Faith, but every 10 minutes something would surprise me on just how well crafted that game really is. And I really hope that Airdorf continues making more Faith games, and even if he doesn't, whatever he works on next I'm sure will be amazing. And I want to say, Haunting Ground has become one of my favorite horror games. It was the only game where I played that the protagonist couldn't fight back. The game was stressful, but not in a bad way. It had some moments of frustration, but it was fun, and it's a shame that there's no way to play it on modern hardware. In the end, I had so much fun with these horror games, and I want to try out more next. What are some of your favorite horror games and what would you recommend? I think after all of this, I just want to try to play an easy to follow and easy to play horror game next.
You know me, the fighting freak Knuckles, and we're at Pumpkin Hill. You ready? I ain't gon' let it get to me, I'm just gon' creep down in Pumpkin Hill, I got to find my lost piece. I know that it's here, I can sense it in my feet. The great emerald